Drive through the American South on any Sunday morning, and you'll witness something remarkable. Parking lots overflowing at churches that seat thousands, radio stations dominated by gospel music, and fire and brimstone sermons. Billboards proclaiming salvation every few miles, and communities where asking, "What church do you attend?" is as common as asking about the weather. The numbers are staggering. While only about 25% of Americans attend religious services weekly nationwide, in states like Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee, that figure jumps to over 50%. Some southern counties have more churches per capita than gas stations. But here's what makes this phenomenon truly fascinating. The South wasn't always the Bible Belt. In colonial times, the region was actually less religious than New England. The Puritans built their entire society around rigid Christian doctrine, while early Southern colonists were often motivated more by profit than piety. Yet somehow, over the course of 3 centuries, the American South became the most intensely religious region in the developed world. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we uncover the surprising stories behind America's most enduring cultural mysteries. I'm your host, and I'm about to take you on a journey through the complex forces that transformed the South from a land of tobacco planters and pragmatic settlers into a region where faith shapes politics, culture, and daily life in ways that baffle outsiders and define insiders. This isn't just a story about religion. It's a story about how trauma, isolation, economic hardship, and social upheaval can forge cultural identities so powerful they persist for generations. Because the South's religious intensity isn't an accident of history. It's the result of specific historical forces that created unique conditions for a particular kind of Christianity to take root and flourish. Our story begins not with revivals or tent meetings, but with something much more mundane: the brutal realities of colonial life in the American South. Unlike New England, where Puritan communities were carefully planned and tightly organized around church and meeting house, the early South was a scattered, chaotic frontier where survival took precedence over salvation. The Virginia Company didn't send the first colonists to Jamestown to build a city on a hill. They sent them to make money. The early Chesapeake settlements were rough, male-dominated societies where the Anglican Church existed more on paper than in practice. Clergymen were scarce, churches were few, and many colonists lived their entire lives without regular access to organized religion. This wasn't because Southerners were inherently less religious than their northern counterparts. It was because the conditions of Southern life made traditional European forms of Christianity difficult to maintain. Plantations were spread across vast distances, making regular church attendance impractical. The social hierarchies that supported established churches in Europe didn't translate well to a frontier society where success depended more on adaptability than tradition. But as the 18th century progressed, something began to change. The South was becoming more settled, more prosperous, and more socially stratified. Wealthy planters built grand houses and imported European luxuries, creating an aristocratic culture that rivaled anything in the Old World. Yet this prosperity came with a moral contradiction that would shape Southern religion for centuries. It was built on the labor of enslaved human beings. This is where our story takes its first dramatic turn, because the institution of slavery created unique religious pressures that didn't exist elsewhere in colonial America. The question of how to Christianize enslaved people while maintaining their subjugation became one of the central challenges facing Southern society. Initially, many planters resisted efforts to convert their slaves to Christianity, fearing that baptism might lead to demands for freedom or equality. But by the mid-18th century, a different approach emerged, a version of Christianity that emphasized spiritual freedom while accepting earthly bondage, that promised salvation in the next world while demanding obedience in this one. This selective interpretation of Christian doctrine required careful theological work. Southern ministers developed elaborate justifications for slavery based on biblical passages, arguing that God had ordained different roles for different races, and that accepting one's earthly station was a form of Christian virtue. This wasn't just religious rationalization, it was the creation of a distinct Southern theology that would have profound implications for the region's future. But the real transformation of Southern religion began with the Great Awakening of the 1740s, and accelerated during the Second Great Awakening of the early 1800s. These revival movements brought a new kind of Christianity to the South. Emotional, experiential, and accessible to people regardless of their education or social status. The revival meetings that swept across the southern frontier were unlike anything in traditional European Christianity. Imagine gatherings that lasted for days, where thousands of people camped in clearings and listened to multiple preachers deliver sermons that could last for hours. These weren't sedate church services, but intense emotional experiences where participants would cry, shout, dance, and sometimes collapse from the intensity of their spiritual experiences. The famous Cane Ridge Revival in Kentucky in 1801 exemplified this new style of worship. For 6 days, an estimated 20,000 people gathered in a rural clearing to hear Methodist, Baptist, and Presbyterian preachers deliver passionate sermons about sin, salvation, and eternal damnation. Witnesses described scenes of mass hysteria, with people barking like dogs, jerking uncontrollably, and falling into religious trances. To educated observers, these revivals seemed like madness. But to participants, they represented something precious: direct personal access to the divine without the mediation of educated clergy or formal institutions. This democratization of religious experience was perfectly suited to frontier life, where traditional authorities were weak and individuals had to rely on their own resources. The denominations that thrived in this environment were those that adapted best to frontier conditions. Baptists and Methodists, with their emphasis on personal conversion experiences and lay preaching, grew explosively. These churches didn't require years of theological education for their ministers. A man who felt called to preach could start holding services immediately, learning theology and biblical interpretation as he gained experience. This created a religious culture that was intensely personal but also deeply communal. The conversion experience, being born again, became the central focus of Southern Protestant Christianity. But it typically happened in the context of community revivals, where entire families and neighborhoods might be converted together. But here's where the story becomes more complex, because this religious transformation was happening alongside the entrenchment of slavery as the foundation of Southern society. The same revivals that brought spiritual liberation to white Southerners often reinforced the bondage of enslaved people, albeit in subtle ways. Enslaved people developed their own forms of Christianity, often blending African spiritual traditions with Christian theology in ways that emphasized liberation and resistance. The spirituals that emerged from slave communities, songs like Go Down Moses and Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, contained coded messages about freedom and escape that white masters either didn't recognize or chose to ignore. The separate development of black and white Christianity created parallel religious cultures that shared some theological foundations but differed dramatically in their social implications. For white Southerners, Christianity increasingly became associated with the defense of their peculiar institution. For enslaved people, Christianity became a language of resistance and hope for eventual liberation. This religious divide deepened during the antebellum period as abolitionist movements in the North began using Christian arguments against slavery. Southern ministers responded by developing even more elaborate theological defenses of their social system, arguing that slavery was not just permitted by God, but actually required by divine law. The result was a form of Christianity that was simultaneously intensely personal and deeply political, profoundly spiritual and utterly worldly. Southern religion became inseparable from Southern identity in ways that would have lasting consequences for American culture and politics. The Civil War represented the ultimate test of this religious worldview. Southern ministers had proclaimed that God favored their cause, that the Confederacy was fighting a holy war for Christian civilization against godless abolitionists. When the South lost the war, it created a profound theological crisis that could have destroyed Southern religious culture entirely. Instead, it transformed it. The defeat of the Confederacy became, in Southern religious imagination, a form of divine testing similar to the trials faced by the Israelites in the Old Testament. The South became the lost cause, a chosen people temporarily defeated but ultimately vindicated by God. This mythology allowed Southern Christians to maintain their sense of religious superiority, even in military and political defeat. The post-Civil War period saw an intensification of Southern religious culture rather than its decline. Reconstruction brought northern missionaries and teachers to the South, often with the explicit goal of civilizing what they saw as a backward region. This outside interference only strengthened Southern religious identity as a form of cultural resistance. The development of the lost cause mythology shows how Southern religion adapted to changing circumstances while maintaining its essential characteristics. Confederate generals became Christian martyrs, the antebellum South became a golden age of Christian virtue, and the war itself became a sacred struggle against forces that threatened traditional values. This religious interpretation of history had profound political implications. It provided a theological justification for resistance to Reconstruction, for the development of Jim Crow laws, and for the maintenance of white supremacy as a form of Christian duty. The same churches that had defended slavery now defended segregation, using similar biblical arguments and appealing to the same cultural anxieties. But Southern religion wasn't monolithic, and this is where our story becomes more nuanced. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the emergence of new religious movements that challenged some aspects of the Southern religious establishment while reinforcing others. The holiness movement and later Pentecostalism brought even more emotional and experiential forms of Christianity to the South. These movements appealed particularly to poor white Southerners who felt excluded from the increasingly middle-class culture of mainstream Baptist and Methodist churches. Pentecostalism, with its emphasis on speaking in tongues, divine healing, and prophecy, represented a radical democratization of spiritual authority. In Pentecostal churches, anyone could receive direct revelation from God, regardless of their education, wealth, or social status. This appealed especially to people who felt marginalized by both secular society and traditional religious institutions. The development of these new religious movements also reflected the economic pressures facing the South during this period. The region remained largely agricultural and rural long after other parts of the country had industrialized, creating a sense of economic and cultural backwardness that religion helped to address. For many Southern Christians, their faith became a source of identity and pride in a region that was often mocked and dismissed by the rest of the country. The very intensity of Southern religion became a badge of authenticity, a way of distinguishing themselves from what they saw as the cold, secular culture of the North. The Great Depression hit the South particularly hard, but it also reinforced the religious culture that had developed over the previous 2 centuries. Churches provided not just spiritual comfort, but practical assistance to struggling families. The community network centered around churches became crucial for survival during economic hardship. This is when Southern religion began to take on its modern form, characterized by a particular blend of conservative theology, cultural traditionalism, and political activism. The fundamentalist movement of the early 20th century found fertile ground in the South, where resistance to modern ideas like evolution and biblical criticism was strongest. The Scopes trial of 1925, while technically taking place in Tennessee, became a symbol of the broader cultural conflict between traditional Southern religion and modern secular culture. The trial's outcome, a technical victory for the prosecution but a public relations disaster for fundamentalism, only strengthened Southern religious identity as a form of cultural resistance. But the most dramatic test of Southern religious culture came with the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Once again, Southern churches found themselves defending a social system that was increasingly seen as immoral by the rest of the world. The response varied significantly among different religious groups. While many white Southern churches defended segregation as divinely ordained, others, particularly in urban areas, began to question whether their religious beliefs were compatible with racial discrimination. Black churches, meanwhile, became the organizational backbone of the civil rights movement. Ministers like Martin Luther King Jr. used Christian theology to argue for racial equality, turning the same biblical traditions that had been used to justify slavery into arguments for liberation. This created a profound split in Southern religious culture that persists to this day. The civil rights era forced Southern Christians to confront the contradictions between their spiritual beliefs and their social practices in ways that were often painful and divisive. Some churches evolved, abandoning their defense of segregation and developing more inclusive interpretations of Christian doctrine. Others doubled down on traditional positions, often by shifting their focus from explicit racial arguments to broader cultural issues like family values, individual responsibility, and resistance to federal government interference. The latter approach proved particularly effective at maintaining religious intensity while adapting to changing social conditions. By the 1970s and 1980s, Southern evangelical churches had become major players in national politics, mobilizing around issues like abortion, homosexuality, and prayer in schools. This political mobilization gave Southern religion a new sense of purpose and relevance. Instead of being a regional peculiarity, Southern evangelical Christianity became a national movement with the power to influence presidential elections and shape national policy. The rise of televangelism and Christian broadcasting also helped spread Southern religious culture beyond its traditional geographic boundaries. Preachers like Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, and Jim Bakker used television to reach millions of viewers with a style of Christianity that was recognizably Southern in its emphasis on personal conversion, biblical literalism, and cultural conservatism. But this national success also created new challenges for Southern religious culture. As evangelical Christianity became more politically powerful and culturally mainstream, it lost some of its character as a regional form of resistance to outside influence. The economic transformation of the South during the late 20th century, the rise of Atlanta, Charlotte, and other major metropolitan areas, also changed the context for Southern religion. Urban, educated Southerners were often less likely to participate in the intense religious culture that characterized rural areas. Yet Southern religious culture proved remarkably adaptable to these changes. Megachurches emerged that combined traditional evangelical theology with contemporary worship styles and sophisticated marketing techniques. These churches could attract thousands of worshipers while maintaining the personal, emotional character that had always defined Southern Christianity. The persistence of Southern religious intensity into the 21st century reflects several factors that continue to make the region distinct from other parts of the country. Rural areas remain heavily religious, and even in urban areas, church attendance rates are higher than national averages. Part of this persistence reflects the continued role of churches as community institutions in ways that are less common in other regions. In many Southern communities, churches still serve as social centers, providing not just religious services but also social activities, educational programs, and charitable assistance. The theological distinctiveness of Southern Christianity also remained strong. Southern Baptists, the largest Protestant denomination in the region, continue to emphasize biblical literalism, personal conversion experiences, and conservative social values in ways that set them apart from more liberal Protestant denominations. But perhaps most importantly, Southern religious culture continues to serve as a form of identity and belonging that transcends specific theological beliefs. Being Christian in the South is as much about cultural membership as it is about spiritual conviction. And this cultural dimension helps explain why religious participation rates remain high, even as specific beliefs may be evolving. The question of why the South is so religious doesn't have a simple answer, because it reflects the intersection of numerous historical, cultural, and social factors that have evolved over centuries. The region's religious intensity is the product of frontier conditions that favored emotional, accessible forms of Christianity. A slave society that used religion to justify social hierarchies, economic marginalization that made churches crucial community institutions, cultural isolation that reinforced religious traditionalism, and political conflicts that turned religion into a form of identity and resistance. Understanding Southern religious culture requires recognizing that it serves multiple functions simultaneously. It provides spiritual meaning and comfort, but it also creates social bonds, cultural identity, and political mobilization. It offers personal salvation, but it also maintains community boundaries and traditional values. This complexity helps explain both the persistence and the evolution of Southern religious culture. As social conditions change, the specific forms and expressions of Southern Christianity adapt, but the underlying functions remain constant. The modern South is more diverse, more urban, and more connected to national and global cultures than ever before. Yet religious participation rates remain high, and churches continue to play central roles in community life throughout the region. This persistence suggests that Southern religious culture fulfills needs that go beyond simple spiritual belief. In a rapidly changing world, churches provide stability, community, and meaning in ways that secular institutions often cannot match. The political dimensions of Southern religion also remain important, though they have evolved significantly since the Civil Rights era. Southern evangelicals continue to be a major force in Republican politics, but their concerns have shifted from defending regional peculiarities to promoting national conservative agendas. This transformation from regional to national political influence represents perhaps the greatest change in Southern religious culture over the past 50 years. What began as a local response to specific historical conditions has become a major force in American politics and culture more broadly. Yet this success has also created new tensions within Southern religious communities. As evangelical Christianity has become more politically powerful, it has also become more divided between those who emphasize spiritual concerns and those who focus on political activism. The rise of non-denominational churches and contemporary worship styles has also challenged some traditional aspects of Southern religious culture while reinforcing others. These newer forms of Christianity often maintain the emotional intensity and personal focus that have always characterized Southern religion, while abandoning some of the cultural baggage associated with older denominations. The continuing immigration of people from other regions and countries to the South has also introduced new religious diversity that challenges the assumption that Southern religion is monolithically Protestant and conservative. Catholic, Muslim, Jewish, and other religious communities are growing in Southern cities, creating new forms of religious pluralism. Despite these changes, the basic pattern of high religious participation and strong religious identity continues to distinguish the South from other regions. Churches remain central institutions in Southern communities. Religious language continues to permeate political and cultural discourse, and religious values continue to shape social norms and individual behavior. The question for the future is whether this religious intensity can be maintained as the South becomes more diverse, more urban, and more integrated into national and global cultures. Some indicators suggest decline, particularly among younger generations who are less likely to attend church regularly or identify strongly with traditional religious institutions. But other indicators suggest adaptation rather than decline. New forms of religious expression continue to emerge. Religious institutions continue to evolve to meet changing needs, and religious identity continues to provide meaning and belonging for millions of Southerners. The story of Southern religion is ultimately a story about how cultural traditions persist and adapt in response to changing conditions. The specific forms of Southern Christianity that exist today are the product of centuries of evolution, but they maintain core characteristics that can be traced back to the frontier revivals of the 18th and 19th centuries. Understanding this history helps explain not just why the South is so religious, but also how religious culture functions more generally as a source of identity, community, and meaning. The Southern experience shows how religion can serve as both a conservative force that preserves traditional values and a progressive force that adapts to new circumstances. The intensity of Southern religious culture also reflects the particular historical experiences that have shaped the region. The legacy of slavery and segregation, the trauma of military defeat and economic marginalization, the challenges of rapid social change, and the ongoing tension between traditional and modern values. These experiences have created a form of Christianity that is simultaneously deeply personal and intensely communal, profoundly spiritual and thoroughly political, rigorously traditional and remarkably adaptive. This complexity helps explain both the appeal and the persistence of Southern religious culture. As the South continues to change and evolve, its religious culture will undoubtedly change as well. But the basic pattern of high religious participation and strong religious identity seems likely to persist, albeit in new forms that reflect contemporary conditions and concerns. The South's religious intensity represents one of the most distinctive aspects of American regional culture, and understanding its origins and evolution provides insights into broader questions about how communities maintain identity and meaning in rapidly changing societies. Whether this religious culture will continue to thrive, decline, or transform into something entirely new remains to be seen. But its persistence through centuries of dramatic social, economic, and political change suggests that it fulfills deep human needs for community, meaning, and identity that are unlikely to disappear entirely. That brings us to the end of our exploration of Southern religious culture here at Professor Archive. From colonial tobacco plantations to modern megachurches, we've traced the complex historical forces that created one of America's most distinctive regional characteristics. If this deep dive into the intersection of faith, culture, and history has given you new insights into how communities form and maintain their identities, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We've got many more investigations into the hidden forces that shape American culture and society. What aspects of Southern religious culture surprised you most? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and remember, understanding how religious traditions develop and persist helps us better understand the role of faith in human societies everywhere. Until next time, this is Professor Archive reminding you that the most powerful cultural forces are often those that serve multiple purposes simultaneously, binding communities together while providing individual meaning and purpose.